She came in carrying a casserole dish and wearing a smile I didn't trust. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the dish. Heather made her turkey and wild rice casserole whenever she wanted something. I'd figured that out within the first year she and my son were together. The smile was the tell. Too wide, too warm for a Tuesday afternoon in November when she hadn't called ahead. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and told her to come in. My name is not important. What I am is 68 years old, widowed 4 years ago, and the owner, or so people assume, of a house in Oakville, Ontario that my husband spent 32 years paying off. A house with a wraparound porch he built himself one summer when our son was 12 and kept getting in the way with a toy hammer. A house where I raised that boy, buried 2 cats, grew tomatoes that never quite ripened, and learned what it felt like to sleep alone after 4 decades of sharing a bed with someone who snored. My husband's name was Norman. He was an accountant by trade and a worrier by nature, and before he died, he did something I didn't fully understand at the time. He put the house in a trust. Not our names, not my name alone. A trust administered by his colleague at the firm, a man named Arthur, who wore the same style of gray wool cardigan every time I saw him and spoke very slowly, very carefully, the way you speak when you want to make sure nothing is misunderstood. Norman explained it to me twice. Once at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a cup of tea that went cold while he talked. Once again from the hospital bed 2 weeks before he died, when his voice was thin and his hands shook, but his eyes were still clear. "The house isn't in your name," he said. "That's not an accident. Don't let anyone tell you it needs to be." I nodded. I didn't entirely follow the legal mechanics, but I understood the intent. Norman had watched what happened to his aunt when she got older. How the family circled. How a woman who had been sharp and capable her whole life suddenly couldn't make a decision without someone questioning it. Norman had spent the last 2 years of his life making sure that wouldn't happen to me. I thought about that trust maybe once a year. When I renewed the property tax, when Arthur sent his annual statement, when I looked out at the porch in the evening and thought about Norman. I didn't leave a note. Both hath bad ether arrived with her casserole. I should have. My son. I'll call him my son because that's what he is and what matters. He married Heather 6 years ago. He was 41, she was 37. I had met her twice before the engagement and 4 times before the wedding, and I had never once felt that she disliked me. That was, I understand now, because she didn't. She didn't dislike me. She simply considered me a resource. The wedding was in Niagara-on-the-Lake at a vineyard that cost more than I wanted to think about. My son asked if I could help with a portion of the bill. I said yes, because he was my son and I had the money, and Norman would have said yes too, probably while pretending to grumble about it first. I gave them $40,000. It was not a loan. I told him that clearly. In the years that followed, Heather was polite at Christmas. She remembered I took my coffee with 1 sugar. She sent a card on my birthday, always signed in her handwriting. Never my son's. She called occasionally. She asked how I was managing. That word, managing, always sat strangely with me. I wasn't managing. I was living. There's a difference. I went to my book club on Thursdays. I took a watercolor class at the community center. I drove myself to my appointments, maintained my garden, had my friends over for dinner. I was not a woman in decline. I was a woman in her 60s with a full life and a quiet house and a level of contentment that I had worked very hard to earn. But Heather asked how I was managing. Every time. I should have paid more attention to that. She set the casserole on the counter and took off her coat and asked if she could put on the kettle, as though it were her kitchen. I said of course, and sat down at the table, and we talked about nothing for a few minutes. The weather, my son's new project at work, whether the community center had fixed the parking situation yet. Then she pulled out a folder. Not a thin folder, a thick one, the kind with the little pockets on the inside. The kind you bring to a meeting. I looked at the folder and I looked at her and I said, "What's that?" She said she'd been doing some thinking about me, about the house, about what would happen if something, and here she paused, tilted her head, gave me the careful face people make when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. If something were to change with my health or my circumstances. I told her my health was fine. She said she knew that. Of course she knew that. But it was about planning, being proactive. She said that word, the way people say it when they want to sound like they're doing you a favor. She opened the folder. There was a brochure, one of those glossy ones, with photographs of smiling older people playing cards in a sunroom. Heritage Crest Retirement Living, it said across the top, and below that, in smaller letters, a community built for the next chapter, in Mississauga, 40 minutes away. I didn't leave a note, pick up the brochure. She talked for a while, about the amenities, about the peace of mind, about how the house was a lot to maintain for one person and how the stairs, she mentioned the stairs twice, were a concern. I had never once had a concern about my stairs. I went up and down them every day. I was not a woman who had concerns about stairs. I said at tea that table. That was a lie. I was not going to think about it. But I have never been the kind of person who confronts before I understand, and I didn't yet understand what I was looking at. She left the brochure on the table. She didn't push further. She said she just wanted me to have information, that was all, and she poured herself a cup of tea and we talked about something else and then she left. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she was gone. I called my son that evening. He seemed unsurprised that she'd visited. He said a little too carefully that they'd just been talking and they were both worried about me, and maybe it was worth considering options. He used the word options. Norman used to say that when someone starts talking about your options, they've already picked the one they want for you. I said at tea that table. I called Arthur the next morning. Arthur answered on the second ring, which he always did. He was that kind of man. I told him what had happened, and he listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a pause, and then he said, "I think you should come in." I just sat at night tea that might open on his desk. He walked me through it again, the terms of the trust, what was held in it, who could make decisions about it, and under what circumstances. Norman had structured it carefully. The house was held in the trust. My investment accounts, a modest RRSP and a TFSA Norman had added to for years, were also directed by the trust. The assets were not in my name in a way that could simply be taken over. Arthur used the word conservatorship. He explained that in Ontario, the equivalent process would involve an application for guardianship of property, that someone could theoretically apply to the court to manage my finances if they could demonstrate I was incapable. But the assets they'd need to manage weren't actually held in my name the way they thought. The trust had a trustee. That trustee was Arthur. The beneficiary was me. He said, "There's nothing to appoint a guardian over, at least not in the way they might be imagining." I drove home and sat on the porch even though it was cold and I had to wear my coat and my good wool hat. I looked at the yard Norman had planted, the serviceberry tree, the rose of Sharon that came back every year even when I forgot to tend it. And I thought about him sitting across from me at that yellow legal pad with his cold cup of tea. He had known, not about Heather specifically, not about this specifically, but he had known the shape of the thing. He had known that someone, someday, might decide that a woman living alone in the house was a problem to be solved, and he had quietly, without fanfare, without ever making me feel pitied or fragile, made sure that the house couldn't be used as a lever. I didn't cry. I sat on the porch, and I felt something that was harder to name than sadness. Gratitude, maybe? Or maybe just the particular ache of loving someone who was no longer there to be thanked. 3 weeks later, my daughter-in-law called and said she'd found a lawyer she wanted me to speak with. Someone who specialized in elder planning, she said. She thought it might be reassuring for all of us. She said she and my son could come with me for support. I said that was thoughtful of her. She set a date, a Saturday in February, which I agreed to because I wanted to see how far this would go. We sat in a boardroom, my son Heather, myself, and a lawyer who had very good shoes and introduced himself twice. He was pleasant. He asked me questions about my daily life, my health, my finances. He said he wanted to get a full picture. I answered everything honestly. Then he said he'd like to discuss the possibility of a formal arrangement for asset management, given the complexity of maintaining a property of that size on a single income in retirement. I asked him which assets he had in mind. He looked at the folder in front of him, a different folder from Heather's, thicker, with a small logo on the cover, and he named them. The house. Any investment accounts in my name. Any property? I said, the house isn't in my name. He looked up. I said it again, quietly. The house is held in a family trust established by my late husband. It has a trustee. I am the beneficiary. There is no property in my name to be managed. He glanced at Heather. Heather looked at my son. My son looked at me. I said, the investment accounts named in the trust are also directed by the trustee. They are not assets I hold personally in a way that would be subject to a guardianship application. There was a silence that lasted long enough that I could hear the ventilation in the ceiling. The lawyer said, carefully, that he hadn't been aware of that arrangement. I said it was understandable. It wasn't something that had come up. He said that changed some of the, and here he paused, some of the assumptions underlying the conversation. I said I imagined it did. My son said my name, once, quietly. I looked at him for a moment. He was 47 years old, and he looked, right then, very much like he had at 12 when he'd broken something in the house and was waiting to find out how bad the consequences would be. I felt the old pull of it, the instinct to soften, to reassure, to make it easier for him. I had been making things easier for him for 47 years. I said, I'd like to go home now. The lawyer said something about follow-up. I said that wasn't necessary. I thanked him for his time, which I meant genuinely because it is not his fault he was hired for something that turned out to be impossible, and I put on my coat and I walked out. My son caught up with me in the parking lot. He said he was sorry. He said Heather had been the one who found the lawyer, that he had gone along because he was worried about me and didn't want to fight about it. He said he knew it wasn't right the way it had been handled. I looked at him and I said, I know. I didn't know. He is not a bad man. He is a man who loves his wife and has trouble saying no and sometimes takes the easier path when the harder one feels like conflict. Norman was never like that, but my son is not Norman, and I had known that since he was small, and loving him had never required him to be. I drove home alone. Heather didn't call for 2 months. When she did, she was polite. She asked how I was doing. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I said there weren't, which was mostly true. I don't hold on to things the way I used to. There isn't enough time left for that. My son comes for dinner on the last Sunday of every month. He comes alone, most of the time. We eat at the kitchen table where his father used to sit, and we talk about his job and my book club and the serviceberry tree in the yard that Norman planted. Sometimes he stays late, and we watch something on television, and when he leaves, he hugs me at the door the way he did when he was young, both arms, the kind of hug that means something. That's enough. It's not everything, but it's enough. Arthur still sends the annual trust statement in January. I read it carefully now, every line the way Norman would have wanted. The house is still there. The accounts are still there. Everything Norman built is still standing, still doing exactly what he designed it to do. I think about him on the porch sometimes, especially in the spring when the Rose of Sharon starts to come back. He was not a demonstrative man. He didn't say I love you the way people in films say it. He said it the way accountants say things, in the fine print, in the details, in the documents he filed quietly and never asked to be thanked for. But I know what it meant. I put the Heritage Crest brochure in the recycling bin the same evening Heather left it on my table. I didn't think about it again. The stairs are fine. I am 68 years old, and I know who I am, and Norman made sure that who I am cannot be taken from me without my consent. That is the only thing I needed to know. I think about that yellow legal pad sometimes. Norman sitting across from me at this same kitchen table, his tea going cold, his handwriting careful and small, the way it always was. He wasn't a man who made speeches. He didn't frame what he was doing as protection or love or foresight. He just did it, quietly, the way he did most things that mattered. And for years I didn't fully understand what he'd given me. I understood it that afternoon in the boardroom, when I said 5 words and watched the air go out of the room. What I've come to believe is that the things we do with integrity, not for applause, not because someone is watching, have a way of holding. Norman didn't set up that trust to win an argument he'd never be alive to see. He did it because it was the right structure for our situation, because he was careful and thorough, and he took seriously the responsibility of protecting what we built together. That's what I mean when I say integrity isn't about being good in the moments when it's easy. It's about the decisions you make in the quiet when no one is keeping score. And there's something about wisdom that I didn't fully appreciate when I was younger. Norman used to say that the worst financial mistakes people make aren't from greed. They're from assuming that the people around them will always want what's best for them. That sounds cynical. I don't think he meant it that way. He meant be clear-eyed. Love people, but understand them clearly. Know what you have, know how it's structured, know who is named in what document and why. That kind of clarity isn't paranoia. It's respect for your own life's work. I didn't fight Heather. I didn't raise my voice in that boardroom, didn't say anything unkind, didn't make a scene. I answered every question honestly, and then I said what was true: the house isn't in my name. 5 words. The strength in that moment didn't come from anger or from wanting to win. It came from being prepared, from having done the work years earlier, or rather from having a husband who did it and made sure I understood it before he was gone. Steadiness under pressure is something you build long before the pressure arrives. I think about the women I know who weren't prepared. A friend whose husband died without a will, whose in-laws contested the property for 2 years. A neighbor who signed things she didn't read because her children said it was easier. Easier for whom? I always wondered. The people who love you and the people who want something from you can look identical for a very long time. The difference only shows up in the paperwork. I am 68 years old. I live alone in a house that is not technically in my name but is In every way that matters, mine. I tend the garden Norman planted. I go to book club on Thursdays. I have dinner with my son on the last Sunday of every month. And I don't hold what happened against him, because he is not a bad man, and life is too short for that. What I know now, in a way I couldn't have articulated before all of this, is that a life built on honest choices and clear thinking doesn't just feel better, it holds up. When someone comes to dismantle it, there's nothing loose to pull at. That's not luck. That's what Norman and I built together, year by year, decision by decision, in the ordinary hours of an ordinary life. The Rose of Sharon came back again this spring. It always does.